I was really erring back and forth on the wanting to do a little program on comic books here on AOD. We're already covering films, the audiobooks, the music show Mandala, and the classic television series retrospectives. We have recorded conversations on art and culture in general under the Cinedelia slash or Hacking Away banner, recorded with Noel Oakeshott. Otherwise, they may not have been worth uploading in the first place. And then attempts at playlists, culture, media, psychological sensations are induced and playfully experimented with via the Yowie Hours. Season 4 I still need to complete and upload for quite some time now, actually. So that leaves, in my own estimation, in analysing the source of that missing piece, I feel, the medium of, well, comic books. I do really like comic books. I love that you had the visual grandeur of the film medium without the potential limitations of costly VFX where live action films are concerned, and general financing stresses where wider animation is constantly concerned. It seemed as though anything was possible in comic books, just what you could draw and which storylines you were able to imagine. When one is composing written fictional prose, it can be sometimes difficult, maybe even potentially irrelevant, to have a strict visual graph of the events occurring, usually as much as seems artistically appropriate. To some degree, it is the reader who constructs the visual component of a literary text. With a comic book, an artist slash writer has to rely on a very visual, grounded ethos. What a film director, screenwriter, or general storyteller would only dream of, a limitless supply and variety of sets and settings, not subject to budgetary or logistical difficulties or general animation restrictions slash challenges at large. That is why I've always had a great faith in the potential of comic books, of meeting halfway where the animated medium can accomplish, more fulfilling capacity, again without the stresses of financial logistical difficulties which have haunted the medium since her origins. Now, obviously, comic books don't have a superlative reputation, even compared to the animated medium, which is largely geared, due to financial necessities, to the most easily entertained demographics, smaller children, whereas arguably comic books were and still are more geared toward adolescents or young adults, and typically, if not exclusively, males at that. The grandiose technological achievements of certain acclaimed animated features, plus their potentially wholesome ethos, if intended toward a family audience more so, enables their lauded reception amongst the cultural columnists, but comic books tended to rely on, narratively, an abundance of typically violent power fantasies written with prospectively introverted adolescent boys in mind. I would perhaps argue that comic books have a great gift of being able to induce the pulpiest and most gratifying of genre fiction excesses, and among these will include, most famously and iconically, the massive superhero power fantasy trends, but also a great wealth of horror bombast, fantastical dreaming in general, science fiction enthusiasm, and even highly stylized, partly humorous, partly existential dramatic exercises from Eisner to Klaus to Satrapi. I will be gradually distilling what I consider the appeals of the comics medium by celebrating a particular text on each of the uploads for this series, which, the acronym you see in the title, it stands for So Comics Can Be Cool, Who Knew? I think many are rightfully skeptical of this medium, partly because of the reasons I outlined, I suppose, and so I want to champion the best that it has to offer, Western comics or manga, just by the way, in order that any skeptics can realize the great, possibly limitless genre fiction potentials which comic books and their writers and artists are and have been highly capable at. And so this brings us to the first title I was compelled to discuss, Grant Morrison and Steve Yowell's Zenith, in this case the first of four phases of its grand audacious storyline. Zenith was a comic strip which ran in Britain's legendary anthology series 2000 AD from 1987 to 1992 in four separate series, phases as we know them, and one which attempted to turn the now cliche superhero genre on its big head. Now, Watchmen had already made an enormous splash in the mid 1980s, also from British artists, Moore and Gibbons, both illustrious 2000 AD alumni, although Grant Morrison claims that he had the idea for Zenith prior to Watchmen's publication, albeit adjusting the series where he felt it was too similar to Moore's work, or maybe just unable to compete with it outright. The end result was a work which he has once described as Watchmen remixed by Stock Aitken Waterman. On it's worth mentioning 2000 AD, whilst it was a science fiction oriented comic book anthology, had not featured a superhero character prior to Zenith. He was 2000 AD's first superhero and its greatest, perhaps one of its few to this day, I would imagine. Zenith decided to instead of proposing existential dilemmas and genre deconstruction, explore a playful metaphor of costumed superhero vigilantes as generational metaphors. Indeed, Xenoph might be the most entertaining act of cultural metaphor ever realized. The legendary Greatest Generation, the Baby Boomers, and Generation X, an iconic tension which had reached a major head in the late 1980s and is the major focus of Xenoph's thematic aspirations, certainly where the United Kingdom's cultural context is concerned. In the 40s, Britain had Maximan to defend itself from the ruthless Nazi-devised superhuman known as Masterman, and they were able to recreate elements of these individuals for the 1960s, titled initially Task Force UK, but then renaming themselves to Cloud9 of their own volition. Tragedy and cynicism would strike Cloud9. They all would lose their powers or disappear outright. And by the 1980s, the only superhuman left was the titular, lovable Xenoph, son of two of the members of Cloud9, by the way. Xenoph is not interested in patriotism or peace and love. He likes pop music, pretty girls, celebrity indulgence, and reckless parties. A Gen X superhero, as Morrison put it. Now, it is worth mentioning, this was not an innovation of Morrison, but of another contributor to Xenoph, and before Xenoph had ever even begun its development. Earlier that decade, comics writer and artist Brendan McCarthy had, with his good friend and collaborator Peter Milligan's valuable support, introduced Parallax, the first media brat superhero, more interested in girls, fame, fun, and paying rent than in saving the world from wicked supervillains. Parallax appeared in the legendary McCarthy-Milligan limited series anthology known as Strange Days, very rightfully so, as well as a short-lived comic series of that same name, Parallax, not long afterward. Brendan McCarthy would design some of the major characters of Xenoph for Morrison and the eventual artist Steve Yowell. Xenoph himself, as well as Mandela, Maximan, Masterman, White Heat, and potentially some others, were given the visual scaffold, and scaffolds not deviated from very much by Brendan McCarthy. McCarthy has spoken in the press about his reservations towards Xenoph. To some degree, he feels as though the series followed Parallax too closely in its narrative outline, but also that Morrison too eagerly took credit for some of the ideas which McCarthy and many others felt as though were pioneered in Parallax prior. Ironically, Morrison would later feel the same way about the existence of The Matrix in relation to his 1990s comic book series The Invisibles, although I think the similarities are less overt there. Plus, The Matrix was inspired by several distinct sources, perhaps a bit too directly to some degree. That being said, there are apparently certain rumours claiming that issues of The Invisibles were a common sight on the set of The Matrix, according to some. But regardless of who did what first, Moore, McCarthy, Morrison, Matrix, the end result is a series which remains one of the most likeable, exciting, entertaining, and stimulating comic book series ever composed, and along with Watchmen, arguably the greatest piece of superhero fiction within that entire medium. I'm well aware of the best Superman stories, Batman, Claremont's X-Men, even Mignola's Genius World. Although in terms of composing great exciting superhero fiction, whilst cheekily deconstructing it, displaying both a love and a deep, insightful understanding of the cultural status of these character archetypes, Xenoph is a completely astonishing work, I will argue. I think so much of it might be that each little strip, issue, prog, whatever you want to call it, was apparently considered by Morrison to be an exciting pop single, or the equivalent of one at least. Each segment of Xenoph was meant to be flash, riveting, engaging, exciting, to the point, and immediately memorable, and yet the entire scope of the series' storyline is wholly ambitious and heady, and this ensures that Xenoph, whilst following a highly ambitious narrative scaffold, is extremely entertaining and bouncy every step of the way, in spite of lofty ambitions, something which I don't even think can be said of Moore and Gibbons' Watchmen, which is almost certainly a superior text overall, yet in terms of the sheer entertainment, a few things are more gratifying than reading Xenoph, that don't involve a woman's company at least. So reading Xenoph Phase 1, some qualities I would like to distill are as follows. Well, I chose not to display images of the panels, as I want to sell one on the text we are discussing and have them experience the artwork, in this case Steve Yowell's genius visual compositions, fresh and without any spoiling precedent. The first prog of Xenoph is a prologue, the account of Maximan and Masterman in World War II, one of the most purely entertaining introductory issues in comic books history. One gets the impression that Morrison would only write what was immediately entertaining to him, whilst inherently adhering to the structural scaffold that his series would wind up following. He claimed to be naturally more inspired by Brendan McCarthy than Alan Moore. He wanted to let his psyche just hang all out there on the page, according to him, paraphrasing that. And I'd just like to reiterate that I cannot praise Yoel's artwork enough. It is beyond brilliant. And this probably goes without saying, but yes, AOD's music program was named after the character in this series, Peter St. John Mandela. My favourite character in the series might not even be Zenith himself or even the introduced later Acid Archie, but St. John himself, Mandela, one of the most intriguing superhero characters ever devised. Morrison has claimed before that Zenith Phase 1 is his least favourite of the four as of the 21st century, as he feels as though it wears its influences too heavily upon its sleeve, although I actually like this about it. And it is not my favourite of the four, though not my least favourite either. I'll share what that one is in the future when this series continues. I enjoy how overtly shamelessly a superhero story Phase 1 is. It is so gloriously pulpy, immediately entertaining, derivative yet excitingly so. It draws the best qualities of certain superhero comic book fiction and distills it in an extremely entertaining yet intellectually engaging series of fast-paced, enthusiastic, visceral yarns. As a distinct, singular standalone series, Zenith Phase 1 is an outstanding read, extraordinarily entertaining, gratifying. I think a great experience, truly. The time it takes to read it versus the volume of events and imaginative ideas filtered into the proceedings. Zenith Phase 1 is one of the most instantaneously enjoyable comic book trade paperbacks you can have on your shelf if that's how you assess these things. In future, we will discuss more of Zenith, but each episode we will focus upon the comics property which I'm most excited to discuss at that time, which next time might very well be the aforementioned Milligan and McCarthy work, Strange Days. So tune in then, if so inclined. Thanks everyone, again.